Zoe Madison had spent her entire life in a small town in Texas, a place where everyone knew each other and dreams rarely stretched beyond the horizon. At 22, she had never stepped out of her hometown, never taken risks, and certainly never been in love. Her parents, devout and traditional, had raised her with strict rules. No parties, no dating, and certainly no men before marriage. Love, they believed, was sacred and meant to be shared only after vows were exchanged. Zoe had never questioned it before, but as she grew older, she began to feel the weight of those invisible chains. Her innocence was both a shield and a prison. While it protected her from heartbreak, it also kept her from experiencing life beyond the walls built around her. Every time she saw her friends move to bigger cities, chase their dreams, or fall in love, she wondered what it felt like to be truly free. Then one ordinary afternoon, a letter arrived that would shatter her world in the best way possible. A door to the unknown. Zoe's hands trembled as she held the thick, elegant envelope. The Lucas Corporation, one of the most powerful real estate firms in the country. She had applied for their competitive internship program months ago, never expecting a response. She swallowed hard before opening it. "Congratulations, Miss Madison. You have been selected for an exclusive internship at the Lucas Corporation in New York City." The words blurred as excitement and fear collided inside her. This was her chance, her way out, her first step toward independence. But would her parents allow it? Would she even allow herself to take such a risk? Zoe had never been on a plane before. She had never lived in a big city, never walked through towering skyscrapers, never felt the pulse of a world beyond her small-town life. That night, as she sat at the dinner table with her parents, she finally spoke the words she had always been too afraid to say. "I'm going to New York." Her father's fork clattered against his plate. Her mother's face paled. "Zoe, that's ridiculous," her father said sternly. "New York is no place for a young girl like you, and working for a billionaire like Henry Lucas? Do you even know what kind of man he is?" The name carried weight. Henry Lucas, a man shrouded in mystery. Some said he was ruthless, others called him a genius. He had built his empire from nothing, turning abandoned lands into skyscrapers, broken businesses into fortunes. His name was whispered with admiration, but also with fear. But Zoe didn't care. This was her dream. "I have to do this," she said, her voice steady. Her mother's eyes filled with worry. "Promise me, Zoe, no matter what happens, you'll always remember who you are. Don't let the city change you." Zoe smiled, but deep down, she knew that the city wouldn't just change her. It would redefine her. Stepping into a new world. The moment Zoe stepped off the plane in New York, the city roared around her. The lights, the movement, the energy. It was nothing like the quiet streets of Texas. Here the air smelled of ambition, of dreams waiting to be claimed. She clutched her suitcase, her heart hammering as she entered the towering glass building of the Lucas Corporation. The lobby was breathtaking. High ceilings, marble floors, and walls lined with portraits of the man who owned it all. Henry Lucas. "You must be Miss Madison." She turned, and there he was, Henry Lucas. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence almost overwhelming. Dressed in a tailored black suit, his dark hair dusted with silver, and his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. There was no smile, no warmth, just a quiet intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Zoe swallowed. "Yes, sir. It's an honor to meet you." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Welcome to the Lucas Corporation." And just like that, Zoe's life was no longer her own. She had entered a world far beyond anything she had ever known. What she didn't realize was that this meeting, this one moment, would change her forever. She had stepped into Henry Lucas's world, and soon he would step into hers. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, casting golden light over a sea of New York's most powerful figures. The annual Lucas Corporation Gala was not just an event, it was a spectacle, a place where the elite gathered, deals were made over champagne, and reputations were solidified. Zoe Madison had never felt more out of place. Dressed in an elegant navy blue gown that clung to her curves modestly, she clutched a flute of untouched champagne, observing the world around her. She had been in New York for only a few months, yet the city had already changed her. She was no longer the naive small-town girl afraid to speak her mind. Working under Henry Lucas had forced her to sharpen her wit, to challenge herself, and to face the harsh realities of the corporate world. But nothing could have prepared her for tonight. As she scanned the room, her eyes inevitably landed on him. Henry Lucas. Even in a room filled with billionaires, he stood apart. His presence was undeniable, commanding yet unreadable. His tailored black tuxedo fit him perfectly, his salt and pepper hair only adding to his timeless allure. People gravitated toward him, hanging on to every word, but he rarely smiled. He was a man who owned everything, except perhaps his own happiness. Zoe had spoken to him a few times before, but never like this. Never alone. Never with the weight of his full attention on her. Yet fate had other plans. A challenge like no other. It started innocently enough. She was standing by the balcony when she felt a shift in the air, a presence behind her. "I see you're not much of a social butterfly," came the smooth, deep voice. She turned to find Henry Lucas watching her, amusement flickering in his icy blue eyes. Zoe straightened her shoulders. "I prefer observing over small talk." His lips curved slightly. "And what have you observed so far?" "That people fear you," she said without hesitation. "And yet they crave your approval." Most people would have stumbled over their words, afraid to be so blunt. But Zoe had spent months working for him. She had seen the way people spoke about him behind closed doors, the way they cowered in his presence. To her surprise, he didn't seem offended. Instead, he studied her, intrigued. "And you? Do you fear me, Miss Madison?" Zoe met his gaze head-on. Number should I? Something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of amusement and something else, something deeper. "No," he murmured. "I don't want you to." Before she could respond, an investor approached, pulling Henry away. But the moment had already been sealed. A game had begun between them, one neither of them fully understood yet. The proposal that changed everything. The night was drawing to a close when Zoe prepared to leave. But just as she stepped outside, a voice stopped her. "Miss Madison." She turned to find Henry standing under the golden glow of the hotel's exterior lights. His bow tie was slightly undone now, the first sign of imperfection she had ever seen on him. "I admire your courage," he said, his voice softer now. "You don't cower. You don't try to impress me. That's rare." Zoe frowned. "Thank you, but I don't understand why you're telling me this." He took a step closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "Because I need someone like you in my life." Her heart pounded. "What do you mean, sir?" "Marry me." The words crashed into her like a wave, stealing her breath. She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" she whispered. Henry's expression remained unreadable. "I need a wife, Zoe, not for love, not for romance, but for business." Her fingers tightened around her clutch. "That's insane. You barely know me." "I know enough." He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "My board is pressuring me. Investors trust a family man more than a bachelor. They want stability. A wife would silence the doubts." Zoe shook her head, stepping back. "You could have anyone. Why me?" A shadow of something vulnerable, crossed his face. "Because you're different," he said quietly. "Because I trust you." The words stunned her more than the proposal itself. Henry Lucas trusted no one. He was known for his ruthless business strategies, for his ability to read people and discard them just as easily. And yet here he was, offering her something that didn't just sound like a deal, it sounded like a plea. "I don't need love," he continued, sensing her hesitation. "I don't want a real marriage. Just a contract. 1 year. You'll be financially secure beyond your wildest dreams. You can do whatever you want after that." Zoe's mind raced. This was madness. A billionaire asking a small-town girl to marry him? She had spent her entire life dreaming of independence, of proving herself. Could she really trade her freedom for a contract? Her breath was unsteady. "And if I say no?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then you go back to your life. I won't force you." Zoe swallowed. Her parents had warned her about men like him, powerful, dangerous, untouchable. But Henry Lucas wasn't just another billionaire. He was a man carrying secrets, a man who, despite everything, seemed lonely. She thought about her life in Texas, the limitations, the expectations, and then she thought about what it would mean to be tied to a man like him, the risk, the thrill, the unknown. Her voice trembled, but she met his gaze head on. 1 year? She repeated. His eyes darkened. 1 year. Zoe took a deep breath and sealed her fate. Okay. The wedding was nothing like the fairy tales Zoe had grown up believing in. There was no white dress shimmering under the sun, no tearful vows spoken from the heart, no family gathered to celebrate love. Instead, it was a cold, calculated arrangement sealed by signatures and a handshake. Zoe stood before Henry Lucas in an intimate yet impersonal ceremony held in a private hall at an upscale New York estate. Only a handful of people were present: Henry's lawyer, a few business associates, and the officiant. No bridesmaids, no flowers, no music, just legalities and a contract that bound them together for 1 year. Zoe had expected to feel something: excitement, fear, regret. But all she felt was numbness. She had said yes to an agreement that would change her life, yet the man standing before her remained a stranger. When Henry slid the ring onto her finger, his touch was fleeting, almost mechanical. There was no lingering gaze, no whispered promises, just a simple statement: it's done. And just like that, Zoe Madison was now Zoe Lucas. The car ride back to Henry's penthouse was silent. Zoe's nerves tangled with confusion. Would he expect something from her tonight? Would she be forced into the role of a wife in ways she wasn't ready for? Her hands fidgeted in her lap as she glanced at Henry. His posture was relaxed, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. But his expression was unreadable, as if he were locked behind an invisible wall. The penthouse was even more breathtaking than she remembered. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the shimmering lights of Manhattan, and the modern decor reflected Henry's personality: sophisticated, controlled, devoid of warmth. As they stepped inside, Zoe turned to him, preparing herself for what might come next. But Henry simply removed his watch, placed it on the glass table, and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I won't touch you, Zoe," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "This marriage is just a business arrangement. You owe me nothing." Zoe exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I just—" She hesitated. "I don't understand. If this is just a contract, why did you pick me?" For the first time, Henry seemed to hesitate. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. "This is to my private study," he said, extending it to her. Zoe frowned, hesitating before taking it. The cold metal felt heavier than it should have. "If you truly want to know me," Henry continued, "read what's inside." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into his own room, leaving Zoe alone in the vast penthouse. Her pulse pounded. What did that mean? Why would he give her access to something private? Curiosity burned inside her as she looked down at the key. And then, unable to resist, she walked toward the locked door at the end of the hall. A truth hidden in darkness. Zoe's hands trembled as she turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves, an old mahogany desk, and walls filled with newspaper clippings, documents, photographs. She stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took it all in. The room wasn't just a study, it was a museum of Henry's past. Slowly, she moved toward the wall, scanning the aged newspaper clippings. Boy abandoned after parents' death. From nothing to power, the mysterious rise of Henry Lucas. Her fingers traced over the grainy photograph of a young boy, darker skinned than the man she had married, with hollow eyes that carried a pain she couldn't fathom. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't Henry Lucas. Then she saw it, a faded birth certificate, placed carefully beneath a stack of old letters. Her blood ran cold as she read the name printed at the top: Elijah Carter. Her hands shook. Henry Lucas, one of the most powerful men in New York, wasn't who he claimed to be. He had changed his identity. But why? Zoe's mind spun as she looked at the documents scattered across the desk, each one unraveling a past that Henry had buried. What had he been running from? And more importantly, what had he done to become Henry Lucas? Zoe barely slept that night. The revelation of Henry's, no, Elijah's, true identity replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. The cold businessman she had known was now a man carrying a hidden past, a painful history buried beneath wealth and power. As the first rays of sunlight poured into the penthouse, Zoe made her decision. She needed answers. Henry was already seated in the sleek, modern kitchen when Zoe entered. He looked effortless, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. But his eyes, always calculating, darkened slightly when he saw her. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She placed the birth certificate on the marble counter between them. "Who are you?" Henry's fingers tightened around his cup. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken truths. Then, with a slow breath, he set his coffee down and met her gaze. "I was once Elijah Carter," he admitted, his voice steady but distant, "a poor black boy from the South." Zoe's breath caught. She had assumed parts of the truth, but hearing him say it, so raw, so exposed, made it real. Henry leaned back, his piercing blue eyes flickering with something she had never seen before: vulnerability. "I grew up in a world that didn't respect me," he continued. "No matter how hard I worked, no matter how smart I was always dismissed. Too poor, too dark, too insignificant." His words settled over Zoe like a weight. "So I made a choice," he said, his voice quieter now. "I built a new identity. I changed my name, my speech, my appearance. I distanced myself from my past, from my roots." He let out a hollow chuckle. "And the world accepted me as Henry Lucas, a powerful, wealthy, white-passing man." Zoe stared at him, her heart pounding. "You hid who you were," she whispered. "Because of racism?" Henry nodded, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't just about hiding. It was about survival. People respect money and power, Zoe. That's the only language they understand. I played the game, and I won." He exhaled, looking past her, as if seeing a version of himself from long ago. "But at what cost?" Zoe felt a lump rise in her throat. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Henry hesitated. His fingers ran over the rim of his coffee cup. "I regret what I had to leave behind," he admitted. "My name, my family, my history." His voice grew rough. "I've spent years convincing the world I'm Henry Lucas, but when I look in the mirror, I don't know who I am anymore." Zoe's heart ached. She had always seen Henry as an untouchable force, a man who controlled everything. But beneath the power and wealth was a man who had fought to exist, who had shaped himself into someone society would accept, at the cost of his true self. And now he was lost in his own creation. She reached for his hand without thinking. His fingers were cold, tense. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold on either. "You're still Elijah Carter," she said gently. "No matter what name you go by, no matter how much money you have, that boy, he still exists." Henry swallowed hard. "Then why do I feel like a stranger to myself?" Zoe's grip tightened around his. "Because you've spent so long trying to be who they wanted you to be. Maybe it's time to remember who you really are." For the first time since she had met him, Henry Lucas, Elijah Carter, looked at her not as a businessman, not as a powerful figure, but as a man searching for something he had lost. And in that moment, Zoe realized something. He wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for someone to remind him of who he truly was. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Zoe and Elijah found themselves drawn to each other in ways neither had expected. At first it was subtle, small, quiet shifts in their interactions. Elijah no longer wore the mask of Henry Lucas when he was with her. The polished, untouchable billionaire persona started to fade, revealing the man beneath. He let his natural curls breathe, no longer pressing them into submission. He stopped speaking in carefully measured words, allowing his true voice, his true self, to emerge. And Zoe? She found herself falling for the man who taught her about business, about resilience, about survival. Falling for the man who, despite his wealth, had been deprived of something far greater: acceptance. Falling for the man who wasn't just Henry Lucas, but Elijah Carter. Rediscovering a lost identity. Elijah had spent years running from his past, but with Zoe, he began reclaiming it. One night, he took her to a jazz club tucked away in Harlem. The dimly lit space pulsed with life, saxophones crying, drums rolling, the raw beauty of music filling the air. As they sat in a quiet booth, Elijah's fingers tapped against the table, lost in the rhythm. Zoe watched as something unspoken flickered in his eyes. "This," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "this is what I grew up with." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then why did you leave it behind?" His jaw tensed. "Because the world told me I had to." She squeezed his hand, grounding him. "You don't have to anymore." Elijah looked at her, and for the first time, there was something softer in his gaze. Hope, a storm on the horizon. But happiness never lasted long. The morning it happened, Zoe woke to Elijah pacing the penthouse, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. She could hear the panic in his voice before she even knew what was wrong. Then she saw it. The TV screen was flooded with headlines. Henry Lucas, the lie behind the billionaire. Exposed, the real identity of business mogul, Henry Lucas. From poverty to power, but at what cost? Zoe's breath caught. They knew. Someone had uncovered the truth. "Elijah," she whispered. He slammed his phone onto the counter, his entire body rigid with tension. "They're trying to destroy me." His board members had called an emergency meeting. Investors were pulling out. Stocks were crashing. The media was relentless, painting him as a fraud, a liar, a man who had tricked his way into wealth. They weren't just angry that he had changed his name. They were angry that he had dared to rise above where society had placed him. Elijah spent the entire day fighting. Calls with his lawyers, damage control meetings, press statements. Every second was spent trying to put out a fire that refused to be extinguished. By evening, Zoe found him standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city. His shoulders were tense, his hands shoved into his pockets. He was unraveling. She stepped beside him. "You don't need to do this." He let out a humorless laugh. "Don't I?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "If I don't fix this, I lose everything." Zoe met his gaze head-on. "Then lose it." He stilled. She took a step closer, voice steady. "You don't need to be Henry Lucas anymore. Be Elijah Carter. Own your truth." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Zoe, if I do that, I lose everything I built. The money, the power, the respect." His voice cracked. "I lose everything." She cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. "Not everything." For the first time, his walls began to crumble. She smiled softly. "You have me." Something shifted in Elijah's eyes. For years, he had convinced himself that love was just another illusion, another weakness he couldn't afford. But here was Zoe, standing by him, not because of his wealth, not because of his power, but because of him, just him. He lifted his hands, resting them against hers. "You don't know what you're signing up for," he murmured. Zoe's smile didn't falter. "I know exactly what I'm signing up for." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. And then, without another word, Elijah pulled her in. Their lips met in a kiss that held everything: fear, longing, hope. He kissed her not as Henry Lucas, the billionaire, not as the man the world expected him to be. He kissed her as Elijah Carter, a man who, for the first time in his life, was no longer afraid to be seen. And as Zoe melted into him, she knew society could take everything from them, but they could never take this. The decision wasn't easy. Elijah stood at the podium, cameras flashing, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. The press conference was packed. Journalists, business moguls, former allies and critics, all waiting to see how the once mighty Henry Lucas would respond to the scandal. But Elijah wasn't Henry Lucas anymore. He gripped the microphone, his pulse steady. He had spent decades hiding, crafting a persona society would accept. Today he was tearing it all down. "My name is not Henry Lucas," he said, his voice strong, unwavering. "My real name is Elijah Carter, and I will not be ashamed of that anymore." The room was silent. he continued, his heart pounding. I built this empire with hard work, intelligence, and resilience. But I also built it under a name that wasn't my own, because the world told me I had to. I changed my speech, my appearance, my identity, just to be given the same opportunities that others receive without question. And I was wrong to believe I had to erase myself to succeed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces were stunned, others unreadable. But Zoe, standing at the edge of the room, watched with pride in her eyes. Elijah took a deep breath. I know this might cost me everything. I know some of you will walk away. But if I lose everything for telling the truth, then so be it, because today I choose to be Elijah Carter. The room was silent for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. Someone in the back clapped, then another, and another. The sound grew, filling the space until the entire room erupted in applause. Elijah's breath hitched. He had braced himself for backlash, for rejection. But what he saw in the crowd wasn't disappointment, it was admiration. He had risked everything, but instead of losing, he had gained something far more valuable. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, the corporate world shifted. Some investors left, but new ones stepped in. Ones who valued integrity over illusion. The media still debated his past, but the world saw him differently now. Not as a fraud, but as a symbol of resilience. And Elijah? He realized he no longer wanted to fight for a seat at a table that was never built for him. So he left it behind. He and Zoe stepped away from the empire he had built, walking into a future they would create on their own terms. Together, they launched the Carter Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping underprivileged kids, giving them opportunities, mentorship, education. Not by changing who they were, but by embracing it. Because Elijah knew firsthand what it felt like to believe you had to become someone else to succeed, and he wanted to make sure no one else ever felt that way again. A love that redefined everything. A year passed. On their first wedding anniversary, Elijah and Zoe stood on the balcony of their modest but beautiful home, far from the corporate skyscrapers of New York, yet richer than they had ever been. The warm glow of the setting sun bathed them in golden light. Elijah wrapped his arms around Zoe from behind, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. You know, he murmured, I married you for business. Zoe turned in his arms, a teasing smile playing on her lips. Oh, I remember. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. His voice softened. But I fell in love with you for who you are. Her eyes shimmered. And I fell in love with the real you, Elijah Carter. He kissed her then, slow and deep, savoring the moment. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't living behind a mask. He was free. And together they had proven that love was more powerful than fear. That identity was not something to be erased, but something to be embraced. That the world's labels didn't define them. Their hearts did. Their story spread, not as a scandal, but as an inspiration. Elijah Carter, the man who defied society's expectations, who chose truth over wealth, who reclaimed his identity on his own terms. Zoe Madison, the woman who saw beyond power and money, who stood by his side when the world turned against him, who taught him that love wasn't about appearances, it was about truth. In a world still struggling with racism, their story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that no matter how much society tries to define us, in the end, only one thing matters: who we choose to be. And Elijah Carter chose to be himself, with the woman he loved by his side forever. The end.